The crimson-stained letter trembled in Faith Fletcher's hands as she stood on the worn porch of her small homestead. The Montana Territory wind whispering through the tall prairie grass, as if trying to comfort her. It was 1878, and the life she had carefully built over the past 3 years had just crumbled beneath her feet. "He's gone," she whispered to the empty land stretching before her. "Thomas is gone." Faith's fingers crumpled the edges of the paper, her husband's hastily scrawled words blurring through her tears. 3 weeks after burying their infant son, James, Thomas had fled in the night, leaving nothing but this note and a hollowness that threatened to swallow her whole. The baby's fever had come on suddenly. By the time they'd managed to fetch the doctor from Miles City, 30 miles away, little James had slipped away despite their desperate prayers. Thomas had grown distant after that, spending nights at the saloon, returning home smelling of whiskey and regret. Faith had hoped the grief would eventually bind them together, not tear them apart. Now the letter made his intentions clear. "I cannot bear to look at these walls any longer, Faith. Every corner of this house reminds me of what we've lost. I'm heading to California. Don't try to find me. I'm sorry." She sank to her knees on the rough-hewn porch boards, her calico dress billowing around her. At 23, Faith Fletcher was alone, a widow in all but name, with 40 acres of unforgiving land and a future as empty as the Montana sky above her. Faith didn't notice the approaching rider until the horse's hooves thundered into the yard. She hastily wiped her tears, tucking the letter into her pocket as she rose to her feet. Strangers could mean trouble for a woman alone. The man astride the chestnut stallion tipped his hat as he approached. "Afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher." His voice was deep, carrying the slight drawl of a man who'd spent time in Texas. "Name's Tucker Finlay. I've been working cattle for the Rocking M these past months." Faith nodded stiffly. The Rocking M was the largest ranch in the county, owned by the Montgomery family. "What can I do for you, Mr. Finlay?" Tucker dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame unfolding with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of coffee. A scar ran along his jawline, testament to a hard life, but there was something kind in the way he kept a respectful distance. "Mr. Montgomery sent me to check if you were needing anything. Word in town is that your husband—" He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "Abandoned me and our home after our son died," Faith finished for him, her voice brittle as winter ice. "Yes, that's correct, but I don't need charity, Mr. Finlay." Tucker shifted his weight, dusty boots scuffing the dirt. "No charity intended, madam, just neighborly concern. Winter's coming, and running a homestead alone is hard business. I could help with some repairs before the snow flies." Faith was about to refuse when she glanced back at her home. The barn roof needed patching, the corral fence had 3 broken rails, and her meager crops were ready for harvest with no one to help bring them in. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I can pay with eggs and preserves," she said finally. "I don't accept handouts." Tucker nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Never thought you would, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll be by tomorrow with some tools if that suits." After he rode away, Faith stood watching the dust settle in his wake. She placed a hand on her stomach, still hollow from the child it had carried, and took a deep breath of the autumn air. She had no idea how she would survive the coming months, but for the first time since finding Thomas's letter, she felt a flicker of something other than despair. The next morning arrived with frost clinging to the grass and Faith's breath clouding before her as she tended her chickens. She'd been up since before dawn, determined that Tucker Finlay would find her working, not wallowing in misery. The sound of wagon wheels announced his arrival. Tucker wasn't alone. He'd brought supplies and another man, older and grizzled, whom he introduced as Pete. "Hope you don't mind the extra hands," Tucker said, already unloading lumber from the wagon. "Pete here's the best carpenter this side of the Missouri." Faith stood awkwardly, hands twisting in her apron. "Mr. Finlay, I can't possibly, just Tucker, please," he interrupted gently. "And these are leftover supplies from the bunkhouse repairs. Would have gone to waste otherwise." It was a kindness wrapped in a lie, but Faith recognized the dignity he was offering her. She nodded, then straightened her shoulders. "Well then, I'd better put on coffee. Men can't work without coffee, my father always said." The day passed in a blur of hammering, sawing, and the comforting rhythm of work. Faith brought water and food to the men, then surprised herself by picking up a hammer and joining them on the barn roof. Tucker raised an eyebrow but made room for her without comment. By late afternoon, the roof was patched, the corral mended, and Faith's small vegetable garden had been harvested, the produce stored in her root cellar. As Pete loaded the tools back into the wagon, Tucker lingered by the well. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, removing his hat and turning it in his hands. "I don't mean to pry, but do you have family nearby? Someone who could stay with you?" Faith shook her head. "My parents died of fever back in Ohio. I have an aunt in St. Louis, but—" She trailed off. Going back east meant admitting failure, conceding that the dream she and Thomas had chased west had died along with their son. Tucker nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The offer to help stands. I can come by once a week, check on things." "Why would you do that?" Faith asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Tucker was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the small wooden cross visible on the hill behind the house. "I know something about loss, Mrs. Fletcher, and something about being alone with it." Before she could respond, he had placed his hat back on his head and was walking toward the wagon. "I'll be by next Saturday," he called over his shoulder. "Got a book you might enjoy. Hope you like adventure stories." As promised, Tucker returned the following Saturday with a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans and news from town. He helped Faith chop wood for her stove, then sat on her porch and told her stories of his years driving cattle from Texas to Montana while she mended a shirt. The next week, he brought a sack of flour and the local newspaper. The week after, seeds for spring planting and a letter that had come for her at the general store. It wasn't from Thomas, just a circular from a mail order company, but Tucker had brought it anyway. Another small kindness that Faith added to her growing mental tally. October slipped into November, and the first heavy snow blanketed the land. Faith woke one morning to find Tucker outside with a shovel, clearing a path to her barn. He stayed for dinner that night, the first time he'd eaten at her table, and Faith was startled to discover she enjoyed his company. "How did you come to Montana?" she asked as they sat by the fire after the meal, the wind howling outside. Tucker stared into the flames, his profile strong against the firelight. "After the war I fought for the Union. I couldn't settle back into farming in Illinois. Too many ghosts." He glanced at her. "Rode with a cattle outfit for years. Saw most of the Western territories before landing here." "And what made you stay?" Faith asked. Tucker smiled, a rare full smile that transformed his serious face. "The sky. Never seen a sky so big it makes you feel both insignificant and infinite at the same time." His eyes met hers. "Seems like a good place to begin again." Faith looked away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "I should check on the animals," she murmured, rising quickly. Tucker stood as well, reaching for his coat. "I'll help. It's blowing something fierce out there." They worked in companionable silence, securing the barn against the storm. As Tucker prepared to leave, Faith impulsively handed him a jar of her blackberry preserves. "For your kindness," she said simply. He accepted it with a nod, then hesitated before mounting his horse. "There's a Christmas gathering at the Rocking M next month. All the neighboring homesteaders are invited. Would you consider coming?" Faith hadn't left her property since James's death. The thought of facing the town's pity and whispers made her stomach clench. "I don't think, just think about it," Tucker said gently. "Sometimes the hardest step is the first one back into the world." After he'd gone, Faith stood in her doorway watching the snow erase his tracks, wondering when this taciturn cowboy had begun to understand her so well. December arrived with bitter cold and longer nights. Faith found herself looking forward to Tucker's visits, planning what she would tell him, saving up small observations about her days. He was unfailingly respectful, never staying after dark unless the weather was treacherous, always careful to maintain propriety despite the isolation of her homestead. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken shutter, Faith found herself studying his hands, strong, capable hands with calluses and small scars that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. She wondered what those hands would feel like against her cheek, then blushed furiously at the thought. "You all right?" Tucker asked, noticing her sudden discomfort. "You're flushed." "Just the cold," Faith lied, turning away. How could she be thinking such things? Her husband had abandoned her just 3 months ago. Her baby's grave was still fresh on the hill. Guilt and confusion followed her through the day and into the night. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of James, his small body cradled in her arms, his perfect fingers wrapped around one of hers. She woke crying, the phantom weight of her son still heavy in her arms. Tucker found her the next day in the small family plot, kneeling in the snow beside James's grave. He said nothing, just knelt beside her, his shoulder a solid presence against the cold. "I feel like I'm betraying him," Faith whispered. "When I laugh or plan for spring planting or feel anything but grief." Tucker was quiet for a long moment. "My younger brother died at Gettysburg," he finally said, his voice rough. "I was there, but I couldn't reach him in time. For years after, I felt guilty for every good moment I had that he wouldn't." Faith turned to look at him, seeing the old pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "It took me a long while to understand that living isn't a betrayal of those we've lost," Tucker continued. "Might even be the opposite. Every moment of joy is like a light we keep burning for them." Faith's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I don't know if I can believe that yet." "You don't have to," Tucker said simply. "Just know that it's waiting for you when you're ready." They sat together until the cold became unbearable, then walked back to the house in silence. At the door, Faith hesitated. "The Christmas gathering," she said. "I think I'd like to go." Tucker's smile was worth the fear that immediately flooded her chest. The day of the gathering, Faith stood before her small mirror, hardly recognizing herself in her best dress, her hair arranged more carefully than it had been in months. The blue gingham was faded but clean, and she'd added a ribbon that matched her eyes. Tucker arrived promptly at noon, his own appearance noticeably spruced up. He'd trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt under his wool coat. His eyes widened appreciatively when Faith emerged from the house. "You look lovely, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, offering his arm to help her into the wagon. "Faith," she replied impulsively. "If we're to be friends, you should call me Faith." The Rockingham ranch house was ablaze with light and noise when they arrived. Faith clutched Tucker's arm as they approached, suddenly overwhelmed by the prospect of so many people after months of isolation. "We don't have to stay long," Tucker murmured, sensing her anxiety. "Just say the word." But once inside, Faith found the warmth and festivity more healing than she'd expected. Mrs. Montgomery, a stout, cheerful woman in her 50s, took Faith under her wing immediately, introducing her around and keeping her plate filled with holiday delicacies. "We've been worried about you out there all alone," she confided as they watched a group of ranch hands attempt to sing carols. "Tucker's been keeping us informed, of course, but it's good to see you for myself." Faith glanced across the room where Tucker stood talking with Mr. Montgomery, his tall frame relaxed, a rare smile playing on his lips as he listened to the older man's story. "He's a good man, Mrs. Montgomery said, following Faith's gaze. "Steady as they come, lost his wife and child in a fire some years back before he came here." Faith's heart contracted painfully. "I didn't know. He doesn't speak of it," Mrs. Montgomery said gently. "But I think that's why he understood what you needed: space to grieve, but not so much space you get lost in it." Later, as Tucker drove her home through the starlit night, Faith gathered her courage. "Mrs. Montgomery told me about your family," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, Tucker." His hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained steady. "It was 8 years ago. Sarah and our daughter, Emma." He was quiet for a moment. "The pain changes shape over time, but it doesn't disappear. You just build a life around it, like a river flowing around a boulder." Faith thought about that as they continued through the snow-covered landscape. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything you've done these past months." Tucker glanced at her, his face half hidden in shadow. "No thanks needed. It's what neighbors do." But they both knew it was more than that, even if neither was ready to name it. Christmas Day dawned clear and bright. Faith had insisted that Tucker join her for dinner, and she spent the morning preparing a modest feast. A roast chicken, potatoes from her cellar, bread, and an apple pie made with fruit she'd dried in the fall. When he arrived, Tucker carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas," he said, suddenly awkward as he handed it to her. Inside was a small wooden box beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. "Open it," Tucker urged. The box contained seeds, dozens of tiny paper packets, each labeled in Tucker's careful handwriting. Sunflower, cosmos, sweet pea, larkspur. "For when spring comes," Tucker explained. "I thought, maybe a garden, something beautiful just for the joy of it, not because it's useful." Faith ran her fingers over the packets, something unfurling in her chest. "It's perfect," she whispered, and impulsively stood on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. The brief contact sent heat rushing through her, and she stepped back quickly, flustered. Tucker's eyes had darkened, but he made no move toward her. "Dinner must be nearly ready," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Smells wonderful." They ate by lamplight, sharing stories of Christmases past. Faith found herself speaking freely of her childhood in Ohio, of her parents and the journey west with Thomas, things she hadn't discussed in months. Tucker listened attentively, asking questions that showed he truly wanted to know her. As the evening grew late, Faith brought out her most treasured possession, a music box her father had given her mother on their wedding day. Its tinkling melody filled the small cabin as snow began to fall outside. "May I?" Tucker asked, offering his hand. Faith hesitated only a moment before placing her fingers in his. They moved in a slow circle in the small space between table and stove, barely dancing, more swaying to the delicate notes. Tucker's hand was warm at her waist, steady and sure, like the man himself. When the music stopped, they remained standing close, the air between them charged with possibility. Tucker's eyes asked a question Faith wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Gently, he stepped back, releasing her hands. "I should go before the snow gets worse," he said. Faith nodded, both relieved and disappointed. At the door, Tucker paused. "I won't be by next week. Mr. Montgomery needs me to help drive some cattle to the winter pastures farther south. Might be gone 2 weeks or more." "Oh," Faith said, surprised by the intensity of her disappointment. Well, safe travels. Tucker studied her face in the lamplight. I'll be thinking of you, he said simply, then slipped into the snowy night. The following weeks were the longest of Faith's life. January brought a brutal cold snap that kept her confined to the house for days on end. She reread The Last of the Mohicans, carefully turning the pages that Tucker's fingers had touched, and planned where she would plant each variety of flower from his Christmas gift. When the weather cleared, Faith found herself watching the horizon, hoping to see a familiar rider approaching. She told herself it was simply that she missed his help with the heavier chores, but in the honesty of night, she admitted she missed his quiet strength, his thoughtful observations, the way his rare smile transformed his face. January gave way to February with no sign of Tucker. Faith began to worry. Had something happened on the cattle drive? Was he injured or worse? Or had he simply decided his obligation to the widow Fletcher had been fulfilled? Then one evening as dusk was falling, Faith heard hoofbeats approaching. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding, only to freeze at the sight of a strange horse and rider. The man who dismounted wasn't Tucker but a younger cowboy with a nervous expression. "Mrs. Fletcher, I'm Caleb from the Rockingham. Mr. Finlay sent me to check on you and to give you this." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Faith took it with trembling fingers. "Is he all right?" "Yes, madam. Just delayed. The cattle drive ran into some trouble rustlers and bad weather. He wanted me to make sure you had enough firewood and such." Faith nodded absently, her attention on the letter. "Thank you, Caleb. Would you like some coffee before you ride back?" After seeing to the young cowboy, Faith finally sat by the fire to read Tucker's message. His handwriting was neat but clearly rushed. "Faith, I'm sorry for the delay in returning. We lost some cattle to rustlers and had to track them into rough country. All is well now, and I should be back within the week. I hope you are keeping warm and safe. I find myself thinking of your smile when the days are long. Yours truly, Tucker." Faith traced the words with her fingertip, lingering on "yours truly." Such a formal closing, and yet something in it made her heart beat faster. She slept that night with the letter beneath her pillow, dreaming of Tucker riding through a snowstorm to reach her. 4 days later, Faith was chopping kindling when she heard a horse approaching. She straightened, using her apron to wipe sweat from her brow despite the winter chill, and felt her breath catch at the sight of Tucker riding toward her. He looked tired and thinner, his face wind-burned, but his eyes lit up when they met hers. He dismounted stiffly, leading his horse into the yard. "You're back," Faith said, suddenly shy. Tucker nodded, removing his hat. "Got in last night, wanted to come straight here, but Mr. Montgomery insisted I get some rest first." His eyes moved over her face as if memorizing it. "I missed you, Faith." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Faith took a step forward, then another. "I missed you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something shifted in Tucker's expression: relief, hope, determination. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and, with infinite gentleness, cupped her face in his weathered hands. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Faith's answer was to rise on her toes, meeting his lips with hers. The kiss was tender at first, tentative, then deepened as Tucker's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. Faith felt something crack open inside her, grief giving way to a fragile, newborn joy. When they finally parted, both breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since Christmas," he confessed. Faith smiled, her first true smile in months. "I've been wanting you to." They moved inside out of the biting wind and sat before the fire, talking until the light faded from the sky. Tucker spoke of the cattle drive, the rustlers they'd encountered, and the magnificent country they'd passed through. Faith told him of her lonely weeks, her plans for spring, the letter she'd finally written to her aunt in St. Louis. "I want to stay," she explained. "This land is hard, but it's mine, and James is here." She glanced toward the window in the direction of the small grave on the hill. Tucker nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He'll always be with you, Faith, just as Emma and Sarah are with me." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But there's room in a heart for more than memory. I've learned that since meeting you." Faith leaned her head against his shoulder, allowing herself to imagine a future different from the one she'd thought was forever closed to her. "I need time," she whispered. "We have time," Tucker assured her. "All the time you need." As February melted into March, Tucker became a constant presence at Faith's homestead. He repaired her chicken coop, replanted her fence posts where winter storms had knocked them loose, and spent long evenings by her fire, reading aloud from books he borrowed from the Montgomery's library. Their courtship was careful, measured, both of them aware of the ghosts that still lingered in their lives. Faith sometimes found herself overcome with guilt, as if loving Tucker somehow diminished what she'd felt for Thomas or James. On those days, Tucker would simply hold her hand or sit with her in silence, offering his presence without demands. One unseasonably warm day in early April, Faith asked Tucker to accompany her to James's grave. They stood together before the small wooden cross, Faith's fingers laced through Tucker's. "I want to plant some of the flowers here," she said quietly. "The sweet peas and cosmos, I think he would have liked them." Tucker squeezed her hand. "I think so too. The land's still coming alive after winter. It's a good time for new beginnings." Faith looked up at him, this man who had walked so carefully alongside her grief without trying to rush or minimize it. "Tucker," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I'm ready for that new beginning if you are." Tucker's face, usually so controlled, broke into a smile of such joy that Faith felt her own heart expanding to match it. He dropped to one knee there beside her son's grave, still holding her hand. "Faith Fletcher, I've loved you since the day I found you on that hill, so brave in your grief. I would be honored to build a life with you, to plant hope where there's been sorrow if you'll have me." Tears blurred Faith's vision, but they were different from the tears she'd shed these past months, lighter somehow, carrying healing rather than pain. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you, Tucker Finlay." He rose and gathered her in his arms, their kiss a promise beneath the vast Montana sky. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Rockingham Ranch. Mrs. Montgomery had insisted on hosting, turning the occasion into a celebration that brought together homesteaders and ranch hands from miles around. Faith wore a new dress of pale blue calico, and Tucker looked both nervous and proud in a clean black suit borrowed from Mr. Montgomery's son. After the ceremony, they rode back to Faith's homestead, their homestead, now in a wagon decorated with ribbons and wildflowers by the ranch hands. As they approached, Faith gasped in surprise. While they'd been at the wedding, the Montgomerys had arranged for workers to plant a garden along the front of the house, using the seeds Tucker had given her for Christmas. "It won't bloom for weeks yet," Tucker said, watching her face. "But I wanted you to have something beautiful to come home to." That night, as husband and wife, they came together with tenderness and passion that surprised them both. Faith discovered that love could be both familiar and entirely new, that her body remembered joy even when her heart had forgotten. Tucker worshipped her with gentle hands and whispered words of devotion, and Faith felt herself truly awakening from the long winter of her grief. Afterward, lying in Tucker's arms, Faith told him about the dream she'd had of James the night before. He was playing in a field of flowers, she said softly, running and laughing. I've never dreamed of him happy before, only of losing him. Tucker stroked her hair. Maybe he's telling you it's all right to be happy too. Faith nodded against his chest. I think perhaps he is. Spring unfolded across the land, bringing new life and challenges. Tucker and Faith worked side by side, expanding her vegetable garden, repairing winter damage to the outbuildings, and planning improvements for the coming year. Tucker officially left his position at the Rockingham, though he continued to help during roundup and branding in exchange for a small herd of cattle to start their own stock. The flower garden flourished, an explosion of color against the weathered boards of their home. Faith spent hours tending it, talking to the blooms as if they were old friends. Sometimes Tucker would find her there, her hands in the earth, her face tilted toward the sun, and the sight of her joy would steal his breath. In late May, as they sat on the porch watching a storm roll across the plains, Faith turned to Tucker with a mix of uncertainty and hope in her eyes. "I think I might be with child," she said, her voice barely audible above the distant thunder. Tucker went still beside her, then slowly reached for her hand. "Are you certain?" Faith shook her head. "Not yet, but I'm late and I feel different." She searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy?" Tucker drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he whispered into her hair. "But Faith, I need you to know this child won't replace James. Nothing ever could or should." Faith pressed closer to him, grateful for his understanding. "I know. James will always be my firstborn, my little star in heaven." She placed Tucker's hand on her still flat stomach. "But there's room in my heart for this one too, just as you said." By July, there was no doubt about Faith's condition. Her dresses grew tight across her expanding middle, and a new fullness softened her face. Tucker became both more protective and more awestruck, watching her body change with a mixture of fear and reverence. What if something goes wrong? He asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her abdomen. "What if I can't get the doctor in time?" Or Faith placed her fingers against his lips. "We can't live in fear of what might happen, Tucker. We can only prepare as best we can and trust in God for the rest." She guided his hand to where the baby had just kicked. "Feel that. That's life, right here and now. That's what we focus on." As summer ripened into fall, Faith's body grew round with new life. They prepared the small room next to theirs, Tucker crafting a cradle from pine while Faith sewed tiny garments from fabric Mrs. Montgomery had given her. Together they made a quilt, Tucker helping awkwardly with the stitching, both of them laughing at his clumsy attempts. The baby was due in December, and as Faith's time grew closer, Tucker arranged for a midwife from Miles City to stay with them. Mrs. Whittaker was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had delivered hundreds of babies and tolerated no argument from anxious fathers-to-be. "You'll wear a path in the floor with all that pacing," she scolded Tucker one evening as Faith experienced practice contractions. "The baby comes when it's ready, not a moment before." December brought heavy snow and bitter cold. Faith grew increasingly uncomfortable, her back aching, her sleep disturbed. Tucker took over more and more of the household chores, insisting Faith rest while he cooked and cleaned with surprising competence. "Where did you learn to make biscuits?" Faith asked one morning, watching him knead dough with practiced movements. Tucker grinned over his shoulder. "My mother taught all her sons to cook, said no man should depend on a woman for his meals, it wasn't fair to her." Faith laughed, a hand supporting her swollen belly. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. I wish I could have met her." Tucker's smile turned wistful. "She would have loved you." The baby came 3 days before Christmas, during a snowstorm that howled around the corners of their snug home. Faith's labor began shortly after midnight, and by dawn, she was deep in the rhythms of birthing, gripping Tucker's hand with each contraction while Mrs. Whitaker calmly prepared the bedroom. "You need to wait outside now," the midwife told Tucker as Faith's pains intensified. "I'll call you when it's time." Tucker hesitated, his face pale with concern as Faith moaned through another contraction. "I want to stay," he insisted. "Please." Faith nodded weakly, unwilling to release his hand. "Let him stay." Mrs. Whitaker pursed her lips but didn't argue further. For the next 6 hours, Tucker remained at Faith's side, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, supporting her as she walked around the room between contractions, murmuring encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. When the time came to push, Faith clung to Tucker's strength, drawing courage from his unwavering presence. "You can do this," he whispered fiercely. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." With a final, tremendous effort, Faith brought their child into the world. Mrs. Whitaker caught the baby expertly, then looked up with a broad smile. "You have a son, Mrs. Finlay. A fine, healthy boy." Tucker's face crumpled as the midwife placed the squalling infant on Faith's chest. Faith looked from her husband to her son, overwhelmed by the intensity of love that flooded through her. "Hello, little one," she whispered, touching the baby's damp hair. "We've been waiting for you." Tucker knelt beside the bed, one arm around Faith's shoulders, the other hand gently stroking his son's tiny back. "He's perfect," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Faith, you're incredible." After Mrs. Whitaker had cleaned up mother and child and ensured both were resting comfortably, Tucker stepped outside into the snowy evening. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline stillness that seemed to mirror the peace in his heart. He walked to the small hill where James's grave lay beneath a blanket of snow. "I'll look after them," he promised the silent mound. "I'll love them with everything I have, and we'll make sure your little brother knows about you, the big brother watching over him from heaven." When he returned to the warm house, Faith was awake, nursing their son with a look of wonder on her tired face. "I've been thinking about names," she said as Tucker sat beside her on the bed. "What do you think of Thomas James Finlay, for both our pasts brought together in our future?" Tucker felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It's perfect," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Just like him. Just like you." As winter settled over the Montana territory, the Finlay homestead glowed with the quiet joy of new beginnings. Tucker and Faith moved through their days in the rhythm of new parenthood midnight feedings, endless diaper changes, moments of pure wonder as they watched their son discover the world on Christmas morning. Tucker carried little Thomas to the window to see his first sunrise. "Look, son," he murmured, the baby's weight a precious burden in his arms. "All that land out there, that's your heritage. Your mama and I are building something here, something that will be yours someday." Faith joined them, slipping an arm around Tucker's waist. "And look at the garden plot," she said, pointing to where the snow-covered ground would erupt with flowers come spring. "That's heritage too, beauty alongside practicality, joy alongside hard work." Tucker turned to kiss her, their son cradled between them. "I love you, Faith Finlay," he said simply. Faith smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting all the hope and promise they'd planted together. "And I love you, Tucker Finlay. Thank you for helping me find my way back to living." Outside, the Montana winter wrapped their homestead in pristine white, while inside, the family they'd built from sorrow and hope faced the future together, stronger for having weathered the storms, more grateful for the sunshine that followed. By the time little Thomas took his first steps the following summer, the homestead had undergone a transformation. Tucker had added 2 rooms to the house, expanded the barn, and increased their cattle herd to 30 head. Faith's garden bloomed in riotous color, spreading from the front of the house to surround the family plot on the hill, where wildflowers danced in the prairie breeze around James's grave. Life was not without challenges. Drought threatened their crops one year. Influenza swept through the county the next, but Tucker and Faith faced each trial together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. When Thomas was 3, Faith gave birth to twin girls they named Sarah and Emma, honoring Tucker's first family. As their children grew, so did their homestead, eventually becoming one of the most prosperous small ranches in the territory. Visitors often remarked on the unusual beauty of the Finlay, placed the careful balance of practical and purely decorative. The way flowers grew alongside vegetable patches, how the graves on the hill were not hidden away but incorporated into the living landscape of the family's land. "It's like they planted their whole lives in that soil," Mrs. Montgomery once observed. "The sorrows alongside the joys, making something beautiful from both." And indeed they had. Tucker and Faith Finlay, who had found each other in the depths of loss and built a life neither could have imagined in those dark days, a life rooted in remembrance, but always reaching toward the light.